The first thing we're going to talk about with this justification of effort is initiations, mild versus severe. And just like with no, this is a little different actually. It is not just like everything else. For initiations, justification of the effort you put in, harsh is more likely to cause dissonance than mild. So this is unlike the punishment things. If you suffer to get something, chances are you will like it better than if it came to you easily. You have to justify the effort you put into it. Aronson and Mills did an experiment with college women. There were three groups. One was a control group and then two experimental groups. They recruited people by saying, who wants to join a discussion group on the psychology of sex? These women signed up. And then for the two experimental groups, one was in the mild initiation group, one was in the severe initiation group. The control group did not have an initiation. For the mild initiation group, they had to recite sexual words, slightly embarrassing. For the severe initiation group, they had to recite really obscene words. And then again, control group, they didn't say anything. After that, all three groups listened to a recording of a group session. Here is what the group will be like. It was boring. Like, it was just a horrible group. After that, all three groups were asked, how much do you want to join this group? The control group was like, no thank you, because it was boring. For the experimental groups, the severe initiation group still really liked the group. They still said, yes, it sounds interesting, I want to be a part of it. Because they had to go through that severe initiation, say those really obscene things, they had to justify why they did it. And they justified it by convincing themselves it sounded like a good group. It was worth it. It was worth that effort. They still wanted to be in it. For the Gerard and Mathewson experiment, they did the same as the above, but it was mild shocks or severe shocks to get into the group, and it was the same thing. They liked the group more, both categories, mild and severe shock, than the non-shock group, than the control group. This is that justification of effort. If a person goes through a difficult or a painful experience in order to obtain some goal or object, that goal or object becomes more attractive. For this, it can even affect your memory. It can cause you to revise your memory of past events in order to justify effort you have gone through. So Conway and Ross did an experiment where half of the participants, all of them were students, participated in an ineffective study skills course. They weren't actually using anything that would help them study. The other half of the participants didn't participate in this course. Then all the participants were asked to evaluate their study skills before the experiment started. And then 3 weeks later, which was after half of the participants had participated in the study skills course. Objectively, there was no improvement in either group because even the group that went through the study skills course, it wasn't actually teaching them anything. However, that group misremembered what their study skills were like beforehand. The control group, the group that didn't go through the course, said, I'm no different than I was 3 weeks ago. Why would I be? That experimental group, the one that did the study skills course, said, I used to be horrible, now I'm so great. They had to justify the 3 weeks they put into this course, and they did it by misremembering what their memory was like, or what their study skills were like before the course started. This justification of effort and actions extends to when you do cruel things as well. If you do something bad, you get over the dissonance by maximizing the culpability of the victim. They got what they deserved. I wasn't being cruel. I am justified in my actions because they deserved what they got, is your thinking. And you see this not just you personally, but also when other people are victims of something cruel. For example, Kent State is a school in Ohio, and during the Vietnam War, there was a Vietnam War protest, and 4 students were killed by National Guard troops during this protest. And after that happened, so this cruel thing has happened to these students, they have to justify why did these kids die in a protest. Rumors started about the students to justify the shooting. Like the woman that died, she was pregnant, she was promiscuous. Promiscuous women deserve to die. They had lice on their bodies when they were found. They had syphilis, they were going to die anyways. Who cares? They had to justify it. They had to make the victims culpable, worthy of death, in order to justify this cruel thing that had happened. So, question for you. Can you think of another example where a victim was denigrated in order to justify the horrible thing that happened to them? Another experiment connected with this was Davis and Jones. Participants rated another participant who was actually a Confederate, a fake participant, and they had to tell them negative things that were given to them by the researcher. So basically, here's a piece of paper, read these things about this other person. They're boring, they're shallow, bad things like that. After they had to read these bad things about this person off the paper, they had to rate what they personally felt about this Confederate, this fake participant. If they had to say negative things about him, they rated him more negatively. They needed to judge why they said these horrible things, and they did it by saying he's basically a bad person anyway. For the glass experiment, participants had to give electric shocks to another person, and after they had to give shocks to this other person, they were asked, how good of a person do you think this person is? I know you don't really know them, but can you rate this person? If they had to give them shocks, they rated them poorly, and there was a negative correlation between the participant's self-esteem and how negatively they rated that other person. So the people with the higher self-esteem denigrated that victim, that Confederate who got shocked, even more. They had to justify it because they had such a high view of their own actions. They would never shock someone who didn't deserve it. They had to justify it by saying they were a bad person. Retaliation also plays a part in this. Berkshire did an experiment where, similar to glass, where they shocked the other person and then had to rate them. But before they rated the other person, half of the participants were told that the victim was going to shock them back, be able to retaliate. Half of the participants weren't told that. If they thought the victim was going to be able to retaliate, be able to shock them back, they didn't rate the victim as worse. They didn't need to denigrate the victim because they could justify the shocking, saying, well, they're going to be able to retaliate, I'm going to get shocked as well. So you don't see this denigration of the victim if there is retaliation or the potential for retaliation. Another thing connected with this denigrating the victim is dehumanization. Dehumanization is the process of seeing victims as non-humans, which lowers inhibitions against aggressive actions and also makes continued aggression easier and more likely. There are lots of examples of dehumanization throughout history. For example, during the Holocaust, Germans called Jews rats. They're fine killing a rat. During the Rwandan genocide, the Hutus called the Tutsis cockroaches and snakes. During slavery here in the U.S., oftentimes enslaved people were compared to monkeys or gorillas in order to justify the cruelty of slavery. Dehumanizing language like that decreases dissonance, but then it also makes it more likely that the violence will happen again. Because if they're not human, you don't need to worry. This justification of what you do also connects to at the systemic level. So system justification is when people born into the highest levels of society justify that position by believing they're entitled to it by virtue of their superior abilities and talents. People who are, you will see this sometimes, people who are upper class will say, if you work hard, you can succeed. If you're not doing well, it's just because you didn't put in the effort. I'm in this position because I worked hard. They will ignore the fact that they were born into that. They got lots of resources from their parents in order to, start out their lives, do well. They blame their own abilities rather than the system because they need to justify why they have more and why they deserve to be able to keep more and why people who are low income deserve to be low income and don't deserve to be helped. A couple of examples of this you see this with famous people too, since they tend to be upper income. For example, when Trump was first running for president in 2016, he talked about how he was a self-made man. His father basically gave him nothing as he was starting out, even though his father had given him millions of dollars in loans. He had to justify why he was a millionaire and say it was all his own effort and not his family. What's another example? Kim Kardashian had an interview where she talks about how people don't want to work anymore and she works hard and that's why she is where she is. Again, ignoring the fact she came from a very wealthy family, and that definitely assists her in staying wealthy in the future. That's system justification. Blaming the victim is when we dehumanize because of the dissonance we feel and our desire to feel better about ourselves in the face of others' misfortunes. We want to feel okay when we see someone hurt, and so we justify it by saying they deserve to be hurt. This is not just when you hurt someone, it's also when you see it in someone else. One way to decrease this blaming the victim is by allowing people to express their sorrow or disgust at the victim's plight. That eliminates the need for this dehumanization, leading to blaming the victim. For example, Harbour did an experiment where participants watched the bar scene from the movie The Accused, which came out before you were born. It has Jodie Foster in it, and she is a woman who is gang raped in a bar. That's the bar scene. It's a horrible scene to watch. And so they had to watch the scene, and then there were two groups. Half of the groups were told to evaluate what they saw, but they weren't allowed to talk about feelings. They only had to write the factual details of the scene. The other group, the disclosure group, was told to freely express their emotions, what they felt as they were watching the scene. 1 week later, both groups, that suppression group and the disclosure group, were asked to evaluate Sarah, Jodie Foster's character who was raped, and answer questions like, did she have bad judgment? Did she appear sympathetic or likable? That sort of thing. The disclosure group, the group that was encouraged to talk about their emotions when they saw the scene, were significantly less likely to blame her for what happened in the scene. The suppression group, the ones who just gave the details, because they couldn't express their disgust and sorrow at the scene, were significantly more likely to blame her for what happened. Another factor with cognitive dissonance and self-justification is the inevitability of something. This is another experiment that Brehm did with kids. Brehm got kids to volunteer to eat a vegetable they previously said they disliked. Half of the kids were told nothing. They were the control group. Just, hey, eat this vegetable. The other half of the kids, the experimental group, was told that they should expect to eat more of this vegetable in the future. The kids who were told they should expect to eat more of this vegetable in the future, because it was inevitable it was going to come, convinced themselves the vegetable wasn't that bad. They liked the vegetable more because they knew it was inevitable they were going to eat it. The I don't like this vegetable and I will be eating this a lot caused dissonance. They're kids. They don't get a say on what's put on that dinner plate, so the I'm going to have to eat this again isn't going to change. What can change is I don't like this vegetable. Their rating increased in order to decrease that dissonance. For the Darley and Burscheid experiment, college women volunteered for a study where they were told that they would have to discuss their sexual behaviors and standards with another woman. They were given 2 folders describing the personality of 2 women. Each folder described the woman at the same level of like good and bad. If they thought they were talking to folder A lady, they rated her as better than folder B lady, and vice versa. If they thought they were going to have to talk to folder B lady, they rated her as better than folder A. But again, technically the descriptions were identical. It was inevitable they were going to have to disclose personal information to the person. Why would you disclose that information to someone you don't like? So they increased their liking of the person they thought they were going to have to talk to. This inevitability also connects with dangerous things, potentially denying danger. California gets earthquakes. We know this. My question for you is, who is going to think about an impending earthquake more? Students at UCLA who live in a seismically unsafe dorm, or UCLA students who live in a seismically safe dorm? Who is going to think about earthquakes more? Okay, it is students in the seismically safe dorm. The unsafe group, the ones who live in the dangerous dorm, that is causing dissonance. Earthquakes are common here. I live in a dangerous place for earthquakes. They can't change where they live, so they change the other fact by just not thinking about it. They don't think about the earthquakes, they're going to ignore it. The unsafe group justified living there by minimizing the potential damage, not thinking about it. In another experiment done connected with earthquakes, done by Lehman and Taylor? Yes, Lehman and Taylor. What they did was they had 121 UCLA students. Again, if you're going to do research on earthquakes, good place to do it. All the students knew about the threat of earthquakes in California. Only 5% had taken precautions against, or safety precautions, like having a go bag, knowing where the closest exit was. 1 in 3 knew what the safest action was to take during an earthquake. You know, getting under a desk, getting in a doorway. No one had taken all of the measures that safety experts recommend. Again, they live in California. No one was fully willing to think about the danger because of that inevitability. So if you think about earthquakes versus veggies, for the earthquakes, it's a highly probable event, just like eating vegetables in the future, but it's life-threatening and uncontrollable. So ignoring it decreases the dissonance. For the veggies, it's not life-threatening, it's just broccoli. So they decrease the dissonance by deciding that it's a good thing. Depending on the danger associated with the inevitability, that is what decides what course of action you're going to take in order to decrease the dissonance. For the next thing we're going to talk about, and this is kind of the last, this is the last slide, this is the last thing we're going to talk about, practical applications. How can you use dissonance to change behavior for yourself or other people? I mean, you can use some of this on other people. I did the veggie thing on my son who refused to eat cooked vegetables, and now he finally eats cooked vegetables. So you can use this kind of stuff on people. One experiment that Aronson did connected to condom usage and safe sex, he got college guys to write a speech saying that you should use a condom every time you have sex. And then he divided the group into 3. A third of the students were told that they would record the speech and it would be shown to high schoolers. Before recording, they had to make a list of all the times that they found it impossible to use a condom. So all the times they were a hypocrite. This group was significantly more likely to buy condoms on the way out of the study and report using them versus a group that never wrote a speech and a group that didn't have to have it recorded and shown to kids. So because they knew these high schoolers were going to see them saying it was so important, they were reminded of their own hypocrisy. It motivated them to change their own behavior, buy condoms, and actually use them in order to decrease that hypocrisy. This is what we call the hypocrisy paradigm. When you make people aware of their hypocrisy, then they're more likely to change the behavior to match their beliefs, to eliminate that hypocrisy. This also worked in an experiment we'll talk about in another chapter. This also worked to get people to take shorter showers during a drought. If you remind them they're hypocrites for taking a long time in the shower, they'll turn the water off sooner. You can use this cognitive dissonance if you're a cult leader. For example, one cult is Jonestown, where almost 1,000 people died in a murder-suicide drinking poisoned Kool-Aid in Guyana. For this, it's not like Jones went to a bunch of people and said, hey, move to Guyana with me to kill yourself. Like, that's not, no one's going to say yes to that. That's not the way he started. He started really small, using the foot in the door technique. He asked people for really small donations of money. After they were okay with that, give more money. Again, that foot in the door, bigger request. Then he was like, why don't you sell your homes and give money to the church? Hey, now that you don't have a home, leave your families, come move to Guyana with me. Now we're here, we're one big family. I'm gonna sleep with your wife and you've gotta be okay with it. And then to prepare for that mass suicide, they did mock rituals where they drank, they pretended to drink poison Kool-Aid to test their loyalty. And then finally it got to the point where they were willing to actually commit suicide or murder those who were not willing to. And again, over 900 people died in this process. So that is that foot in the door. You see this, again, this is, well, no, this, you were not old enough to be cognizant of this. But in 2003, when the Iraq War was starting with Bush, the big justification for why we needed a war in Iraq was weapons of mass destruction. There were weapons of mass destruction. We had to go in and stop Saddam Hussein and get these weapons out of there. So most people in the US believed this. Most people were for the war in Iraq in 2003 when it started. No weapons of mass destruction were found, so they had to add justification of saving Iraqis from a brutal dictator, even though there's lots of countries in the world with a brutal dictator that we don't go in and invade. But we had to justify the action because it had already happened. A behavior needs to be justified, so attitudes have to be changed, and this change influences future decisions. So like for that war in Iraq, I was living in Rwanda for the last half of 2002. And I came back to the States right before the new year. And so when I was, this was 20 years ago, there wasn't cell phones, there wasn't Wi-Fi, and it was dial-up internet, so I checked email once a week. I didn't have access really to what was going on in the US. Wasn't really communicating much with people in the US. And so that was when the justification for the war, there's weapons of mass destruction, but even if there's not, we've got to get Saddam Hussein out of there. I missed all that. I missed that build up to the justification. So I came back 3 months before the war started, and it was like bizarro world. I couldn't understand why everyone was so for this war when it seemed, without all that lead up, without all of that foot in the door stuff, I couldn't understand why we're at the point of war. It didn't make sense to me because I missed all of that justification. That was the first anti-war protest I went to. But everyone here in the US who was exposed to all of that was believing it. The vast majority of Americans were for the war in Iraq when it started. Now, like hindsight bias, if you go ask your parents now, did you support the war in Iraq when it started? Most of them are going to say no. Most of them are remembering it wrong, and they were for the war. They probably weren't going to anti-war protests. Now that we know that it was such a horrible thing for the US to be in this war for 20 years, now people remember it as being horrible, and they always thought it was horrible. But at the time, in 2002, very few people were against that war. That is that justification. They have to justify why they did it. Look, we saved them from this horrible person. So that is self-justification. That is it for this chapter.